Welcome to Forthright Reader Feedback, Not Ready for EVs, recorded at the stations of Spokane Talks Media. This Reader Feedback edition is a follow-up to a column on a few of the hazards of putting more electric vehicles on the roads before the infrastructure is ready for them. Here's the column, as published March 31, 2022 in the Spokesman-Review. The headline selected by the editor, but more on that later. EV fires require additional firefighter training. Refueling your car by plugging it into a convenient electrical outlet is a deceptively attractive idea. Who wants to land at the gas station as prices fly past $4 a gallon? For those who can afford a new car, an electric vehicle must look pretty tempting. There are two major problems with the growing number of electric vehicles on the road. One was well covered by John Harrison in a piece titled, published in the Spokesman-Review titled, "One Big Detail Could Derail Northwest's Clean Energy Goals." We have a logjam in the electrical grid, and it will be well after 2030 before we can solve it. Which is good news for first responders because we have a problem affecting fire departments everywhere. Lithium-ion batteries are subject to thermal runaway and is hard to extinguish as trick candles on a birthday cake. Even conventional vehicles have lithium-ion batteries serving their highly computerized control systems. When the Edwall Fire Station was paged to a vehicle fire in a driveway, our firefighters had a heck of a time cooling down the battery. Just when we thought we had enough water on it, there'd be blue flashes as it arced and rekindled. But EV and hybrid vehicles relying on lithium-ion battery cells as their fuel source kick the fire suppression problem to a whole new level. When a damaged lithium-ion battery overheats, the result is a thermal runaway. The horseless carriage solved the problem of runaway horses, but introduced new transportation hazards as the early automobile industry focused on style and speed rather than safety. Congress was moved to act with the publication of Ralph Nader's Unsafe at Any Speed, The Designed-In Dangers of the American Automobile. It took decades for safety to become a selling point, both for consumers and manufacturers. Now, as Congress and progressively controlled legislatures push electric vehicle technology onto the highway, new hazards are being downplayed by the same industry that resisted prioritizing safety in the 1960s. The dangers are inherent in the design. An ordinary motor vehicle accident involving an EV may be enough to start the runaway cycle. The first step in any response is a good scene size-up, including identifying the problem. A recent webinar presented by the National Volunteer Fire Council and supported by General Motors emphasized both the importance and the difficulty of identifying an EV after a typical motor vehicle accident. With no consistent labeling and manufacturers proudly marketing to consumers how their EV models are indistinguishable from their standard models, the dangers are hidden from first responders. Some fire departments assume every vehicle fire or accident involves an EV. It's the most cautious approach, but it ties up more resources. Tom Miller, certified fire instructor and hazardous materials specialist, speaking at the webinar, explained cooling water is necessary whether there is a flame or not, while monitoring temperature for thermal runaway. Magnesium, titanium, and steel will burn once the battery lights off at 1800 degrees. That intense heat separates water into hydrogen and oxygen, adding a flammable gas and an oxidizing gas to the situation. The toxic gases created when a lithium-ion battery burns result in chemical exposure well beyond simple smoke inhalation. Responders require full structural gear and self-contained breathing apparatus for protection. A conventional combustion engine fire can be doused with the 750 to 1,000 gallons available on a single fire truck. To properly extinguish an EV passenger vehicle requires anywhere from 3,000 to 8,000 gallons, applied directly to the battery compartment to keep it cool and prevent a runaway. And unless the EV has conveniently flipped upside down to provide easy access to the battery, the amount of water may be even higher. A commercial-size EV, like a school bus, may require as much as 160,000 gallons of water applied over a 9-hour period. A response to a single EV incident ties up resources for hours just to keep the battery cool. Such fires are high consequence but still low frequency events for now. Even without fire, stranded energy in live batteries creates other hazards for first responders and for second-tier responders like tow truck drivers. Combined with the latest in automatic driving features, stranded energy has resulted in firefighter injuries when an EV started up with a mind of its own. And Miller pointed out it's more complicated when it's a multiple vehicle accident, like the recent 50 or more car pileup on Interstate 81 in Pennsylvania, which included 6 to 8 EV or hybrids crunched amongst the tractor-trailer rigs. It's probably a good thing the grid is jammed. EVs may be ready for the road, but the road isn't ready for them. That was the column, and the headline didn't really capture what I was getting at. It's not just about more training. There's always training. It's about the fire risks of lithium-ion batteries specifically. While the Fire Service reports 52 EV fires per 100,000 in car sales, and Kelley Blue Book reports only 25 such fires, these statistics suffer from the problem of very small numbers relative to the 276 million registered motor vehicles of all kinds in the U.S. And since EV buyers are currently both wealthier and perhaps more cautious drivers than a cross-section of the population, the number of crashes EVs are involved in now is not necessarily a good predictor of future problems. But back to that headline, it's not the training, it's the response impact. Tying up 5 trucks to deliver enough water and a station's worth of personnel to keep one battery cool for 8 or 9 hours means other calls aren't getting attention or staffing has to increase. Training has to focus on keeping it simple, but that's a problem with no standardization in the electrical systems. Currently, there are 83 different models on the road, each with its own labeling and cabling design, making it difficult to address the question of stranded energy in the battery, creating arcing hazards for first and second tier responders. Then there's the added space needed for wrecking yards, since EVs can't be stored without social distancing to prevent a catastrophic fire cascade. Spacing cars out with 6 to 10 feet between them instead of side by side takes up more space. EVs have a reputation for reigniting as much as 3 days later. One solution is to lift the totaled car with a crane and immerse it in an open-topped cargo container of salt water. But that's additional mechanical and devices that we need to deal with that. Most of the comments to this column were from folks who just hadn't thought much about the issue yet, and that's the problem with any new technology. We start to focus on all the positives, and it's designed in a laboratory, tested under controlled conditions, released to a self-selected early adopters, and then we start to see how it operates in the real world with unpredictable humans and all the other variables. Robert Johnson of Spokane had a list of questions triggered by the column, and I promised to check them out. You'll find an end card on the video with the links referenced here. This is still a developing market, so everything is subject to change, and you definitely have to do your own research. His first question was, what is the lifespan of the batteries to remain chargeable to full capacity and the cost to replace them? Well, the Union of Concerned Scientists predicts the battery will last for the life of the vehicle, which they calculate at 12 years. My husband and I own 4 vehicles, 2 cars and 2 working trucks, and only one of them is less than 12 years old, so I'm not sure where the life of the car is only 12 years comes from. But about that cost to replace batteries, the best guess from a website called recurrentauto.com is a projected cost of $6,200, and they were citing a Bloomberg study. So there's a significant cost, and those batteries do have a specific life, and that was Robert's second question. Battery life would come into play if a person was to keep the car for, say, 7 years. How would it affect the resale value? Well, at 7 years, the battery would have used over half of its life in the best case scenario of a 12-year battery life. But that best case assumes that the owner has paid attention to a whole lot of tips for battery conditioning, as anyone who's ever used rechargeable batteries knows. And so it'd be a bit of a guess as to how much life is left at 7 years. And if you were buying that used car, you'd have to take that into account. His third question, what is the cost to recharge at stations that will be along routes of travel? Good question. Investopedia had an interesting article on EV charging on a road trip, and it's a complicated answer. Right now, you still have to plan a route very carefully to avoid having to drive out of your way just to find a charging station. The convenience store industry and all those travel plazas are working on how to serve this market with charging paid stations. Or you might luck out and get a free fill-up at the hotel as a perk for the hotel. But the bottom line is, according to this article, is about the same cost as if you were buying liquid fuel for the same trip and of the same length. And it'll cost you at home too, only you won't be able to see how much because it's just swallowed up in the power bill instead of showing up on the dial at the fuel pump. Fourth question was, what effect does cold weather, like we have in the winters or hot summers when air conditioning is run for long periods of time, how will that diminish the battery's capacities? Well, Consumer Reports sets 20 degrees at the point at which the batteries have significant problems. And range in cold weather can be reduced by 20% or more. There are also recommendations from some of the EV reports that I looked at to avoid using the accessories in extreme cold or hot weather, including entertainment systems, or in cold weather, including the heated seats, all of those which drain the batteries, both faster in hot and cold weather. Another question was, what if an area has blackouts that last for long periods of time and charging will be impossible, such as Texas? I don't need to look up a website for that. If the power is out, you're not refilling your car. That's actually a problem with gas engines as well, because if the power is out at a gas station, the pumps don't work there. So it's always a good idea to be fueled up and ready to go, whatever your source of fuel is. And finally, what about an EV that sits for a month or more without being driven while people are away? Well, that's part of the problem with the filling up completely. You actually, the manufacturer's recommendations are not to keep your battery charged at 100%. Batteries do lose charge when they sit for an extended period of time. So I was surprised to read advice on a couple of sites that said the battery should be let sit at 75%. And I'd be a little concerned about what that meant when calculating the range of a vehicle if I were to buy one. At my house, if we only charge the car to 75% as recommended, and it loses 20% to cold weather, because we don't have a heated garage, we don't even have a we have a leaky garage, an old barn type of garage. So 75%, 20%, another 5% for sitting for a week, plus the 10% cushion until the next charge, because you don't want to draw the battery down completely to zero. Then you add that all up, and the actual range of any EV we might look to purchase at would really be 40% of its listed value. And that's going to be an interesting thing for consumers to get used to looking at. We're used to looking at these estimates of miles per gallon and give us some idea of the range of the car and city or country driving. We're going to have to get some similar kinds of ratings for EVs to really understand what the actual range is under real world conditions. And I'm not opposed to electric vehicles just because they're electric or because it's become a hot button partisan issue. My only interest in cars has always been, does it work and will it get me where I want to go, and can I afford to buy it and to operate it? But I am concerned about pushing more electric vehicles out onto the roads before the grid is able to handle the charging capacity we need, and before our emergency services infrastructure is ready to handle them. So for now, we're going to stick with what we've got.